Welcome to week 5 of this class on Mills on Liberty. I'm going to, as before in earlier lectures, do a brief overview of what the entire lesson will do, and then we'll dig in more particularly to the texts and the arguments and see where they run. So before I do that, turn up my volume a little bit. So first thing to note, you should have open on your computer as you're listening the overview for today, which gives you as texts about halfway down chapters 1 and 4 of On Liberty. I will very briefly summarize chapters 2 and 3. They're interesting and wonderful in their own right, but they just don't fit as neatly into what I wanted the class to do this semester. So I will summarize the overview here. Hopefully you've already read it. We'll dig into chapters 1 and 4, and then the article by Bill Clinton, 3 arguments for legalizing pot for adult use. All right, so let me go to the outline first, and this is in the file section of Canvas, so you'll probably want to open that up right away. The outline tells you we're going to be talking about Mill's harm principle, which I assume many of you have heard before, which goes something like this. If I'm a competent, rational adult, capable of making my own decisions and leading my own life, and facing the music for the decisions I make, I should be allowed to do things that harm me and only me, because that's my decision. I should be at liberty or free to make the decisions that, for better or for ill, have a bad effect on me. Now, there are all sorts of qualifications to that claim, which we'll see shortly, but that's sort of the basic idea. What is it good for? Mill's going to argue, especially in chapters 2 and 3, we didn't read those at greater length, that let people live their own lives, right, the way they see fit, by their own lights, making their own decisions. And hopefully we're happier for all that. And that has to be the only appeal for someone like Mill. If you recall from utilitarianism, his defense of something being moral was that on balance, it produced more and better kinds of pleasures for sentient beings than it produced pain for them. If the harm principle in On Liberty is to have any kind of, pardon the expression, cash value, it's going to have any value at all, it has to make us humans and others, if there are sentient beings out there that count, and they all count if they're sentient, it has to make us happier. And Mill's certainly going to make that argument. So what you have here in the outline is chapter 1. He sets up the terms very quickly. I will again summarize 2 and 3 very briefly because we didn't read those. We're going to make a deep dive into chapter 4. That's where the qualifications of the harm principle come into play. And we will finish without going through all of the text with what you see here on the outline is 7D. Let's see if I get the letter right for you there, D7D, the examples. So without further ado, let's open up chapter 1, and we're going to look at the first paragraph of the first section in section 9. So, oops, didn't mean to minimize all those windows. So if you look at chapter 1, of course the essay is called On Liberty, so it's about liberty, not everything you needed to know, but just about it, but what he thinks are important points. This was written in the late 19th century, so it would have come at a time when Britain was in full swing with the Industrial Revolution. What's interesting to note here for section 1, and then we'll jump to 9, is he tells you right up front, at the very beginning of the essay, what he's going to talk about. The subject of this essay, if you were highlighting this on a paper copy or annotating it, this would be important, is not liberty of the will. That is, do we have free will? You know, there's an argument in philosophical traditions that if you knew the future, as presumably God does, then those of us stuck in the present really don't have a choice in the matter because God knows, or some really smart person knows what we're going to do. Not what he's talking about. He's talking about, third line, civil or social liberty. So civil society, government, private society, social, right, in society. What are, here's the key question, the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual? So by nature and limits, of course, he wants to say what kind of power can society exercise over us, whether it's the government or friends or clubs or St. Edward's or what have you. What is the legitimate power that others can exercise over your freedom? Open question, just as relevant in the 19th century as it is today. In the post 9/11 world, maybe now in the pandemic world, what we are free to do should have some limits. People aren't free to do absolutely anything they like. Generally speaking, for the harm principle, which is about to be outlined, Mill wants to argue if something you do harms a second party and they don't like it, they don't consent to it, and they don't want it, then that's a limit. Now, how you build the contours or specific, shape of that limit is yet to be seen. So I'm going to jump to, I hope you read all this, section 9, where Mill lays out how this works. Pardon me, I scrolling ahead here. The object of this essay, there he says again, is to assert one very simple principle, really not so simple, to govern absolutely, so this tells you everything you need to know about how society deals with you by way of compulsion or control. So by compelling you, forcing you, or controlling you to do something. Whether the means be physical force, when the law puts you in jail, that's physical force, or, and he's concerned about this too, the moral coercion of public opinion. He means peer pressure there. People talk badly about you. If you have a presence on social media and people criticize you there, you're going to feel the effects of that. That's moral coercion. It's sort of criticism, right, of what you're doing. The principle is, and you should underline practically this whole section, the sole end for which mankind, humans, women too, are warranted to interfere with somebody else is to self-protection. So if you're really trying to protect yourself and someone says, I should be free to do what I want, but what they're doing is like harming and killing you, then by all means, right? This is where maybe you might think the right to self-defense comes in. Next sentence. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised, so he's admitting you could exercise power illegitimately, rightfully exercised, I lost my train of thought here, over a member of a civilized community, so we're talking about post-industrial, 19th, 20th century Europe, United States, anywhere else, against his will, is to prevent harm to others. So if you don't want me stepping on your toes and telling you, forcing you what to do, you have a right for me not to force you what to do, not to force you to do something, only if you're preventing harm to somebody else, right? So if I'm, again, threatening your life, and I want to say, well, I'm free to do that, what you should say is, well, for self-protection purposes, I can draw a line and push back on your exercise of that liberty, in that case, trying to harm you and kill you. His own good, that means the person who you want to stop from doing something that's harmful to himself, his own good, physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. So just because it would be good for you to give up smoking or drinking or skydiving, whatever risky behavior I think you're engaged in, that's not sufficient grounds for me to stop you from doing it. So again, we're talking about rational, intelligent adults, competent to make their own decisions. They want to smoke, they want to drink, they want to engage in skydiving, rock climbing, whatever you think is a risky self-harming behavior. They're allowed to do that, right? And I might want them to stop because it's not good for them. Smoking and drinking in any case, or rock climbing and skydiving because it's risky. But that's not sufficient warrant or reason to make them stop. Me, if you're doing something risky to yourself, I cannot rightfully compel you to do something or to prevent you from doing it, forbear it, because it's better for you, because it'll make you happier, because others think it's smart, right? These might be good reasons for remonstrating with you. I might have an argument with you like, hey, do you really need to drink? Do you really need to skydive? Maybe you should, give that another thought and give that up. I can't compel, though. I'm on the text here, the good reasons for. I can't compel you to stop or visit you with an evil, right? Punish you just because you're a smoker. Let me scroll down so we can see the rest of the page. To justify that is to compel or force you to stop. The conduct from which it is desired to deter him must be calculated to produce evil to someone else. This is important because to stop you from doing something that harms you, that's not enough, because you get to harm you if you want, right? That's your call as a competent, rational, free-thinking, free-choosing adult. But if what you're doing, I can calculate it will produce evil to somebody else, and this is kind of tricky too, we'll have to come back to this later, I get to stop. So if you read the overview for today, the example I used there was smoking. Forget about St. Ed's having an anti-smoking ordinance on campus. Forget about a certain distance from buildings and whatnot. Forget about the city ordinance. If you have a friend who's a smoker and she smokes alone outside her apartment and no one's around, yeah, that's bad for her, to her. That's just the truth. That's medical fact. But you can't force her to stop, compel her to stop, take her cigarettes. You could remonstrate, argue with her, hey, smoking's bad for you. You could entreat, you could beg, oh my gosh, I'm your friend, would you please stop for my sake? You can't compel her to stop unless, and I'm going to go back to that calculated phrase again, right? The conduct that is desired to deter you must be calculated to produce evil to someone else. So if your friend's smoking near an intake vent for an air conditioner outside our building, and the air conditioner belongs to a roommate, someone upstairs, here you might say, whoa, you get to decide if you want to hurt yourself with smoke. That's on you, right? Wish you wouldn't, might argue with you, might beg you. But the minute you're blowing smoke into that vent, you're harming a second party who didn't say yes or no, right? Didn't consent, and we know secondhand smoke is harmful. Now I get to stop you, right? Call the landlord, or tell your roommate, or not physically force you. They're not talking about that. So you sort of get the idea. If you read the next sentence, the only part of conduct of anybody for which he's amenable to society, that society gets to tell them about, is that what concerns others, second parties. In the part which concerns merely himself, the part of your conduct that concerns only you, your independence is, of course, absolute. Over himself, herself, his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. And sovereign is used here in a very explicit way. You look it up, sovereign, king or queen, is to have control, power, and authority. So the basic idea here, I'm going to go back to the outline and stop reading, is, oops, where's the outline? There we go. If you want to do something that harms yourself, and only you, and your competent, rational, free-choosing adult, have at it. I'm not going to force you to stop. By law, I'm not going to force you to stop by moral coercion, like public pressure or peer pressure. I might argue with you, beg with you, but until you're harming non-consenting second parties, that's blowing the air through the vent back into the apartment where your roommate is, you can't be compelled to stop. You should be at liberty, at freedom, have the freedom to make your own choices there. Now, what are the implications of this? Well, you can imagine quite a few. In chapter 2, which we did not read, Mill is going to argue famously that we should protect speech that's false, right? Just completely out and out false, bad science, Holocaust deniers, you name it, as well as protect true speech, because that doesn't physically, tangibly, palpably, materially harm non-consenting second parties beyond them being offended, right? Mere offending somebody else with your speech on a Mill on Liberty framework, and this would be in chapter 2, not enough, right? And you can imagine if we decided to restrict speech as a matter of policy or law that merely offended somebody else, we wouldn't have much speech left to go around, right? Because just about everything is going to offend just about somebody. But if it materially harms somebody, yes, you can have either by law or policy a reason to say, you don't get to talk that way, write that way, print that way, because it palpably, materially, concretely, in a calculated fashion, can harm a second party. And if you think about free speech law, we're going to step away from today's lesson for a minute, the kinds of things that are illegal fit that definition, right? You perjure yourself on the stand, that prevents the legal system from finding the truth and exonerating the innocent or not guilty. You steal my ideas and print a book, that's a copyright violation. I lose money. Same goes for music that's illegally downloaded, which of course nobody does, right? You're basically stealing from the author. That has a palpable physical material consequence to it. Slander, libel, all the ways of insulting somebody that they have lost their reputational interests, right? They lose money because now people won't hire them, or people think that I guess that would be the principal one that would sort of come to mind. True threats, right? That really, really cause people to cause violence. The standard in the law is a face-to-face threat of imminent lawless violence, right? So I'm nose to nose with you. You don't have any time to react, and I say something that makes you want to throw a punch, and there's no time to think about it. Arguably, that would be awful because it would cause a physical fight, and in that case, the mere idea or word leads to a physical harm. So you could almost draw a line through free speech law in the United States and talk about slander, libel, perjury, copyright violations, true threats. I'm trying to think if I missed anything. And all of these things you're at liberty to do, but on Mill's on liberty principle, it's harming non-consenting second parties because it causes a concrete harm, which you can calculate, right? Like if you steal enough music from an artist, he or she can calculate the loss of people who would have otherwise purchased that music, and then he or she would have had some sort of return on their musical creative investment. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, which again we didn't read, the harm principle. What does it have to do with our well-being? Well, again, we didn't read this chapter, but Mill argues even if you have the freedom to do what you want, provided you're not harming non-consenting, adult, rational, free-choosing second parties, if you don't do anything original with your freedom, you're not a creative, unique, interesting person. Freedom's great, right? This is part of what he concludes in chapter 3, but we need more than that to flourish. We need variety in the world. If you want to look at section 18, he talks about how if variety is lacking, we all read the same books, we use the same communication tools, we wear the same clothing. In that case, what's going to happen is you're free to do what you want, you just haven't done anything interesting with it. What did we get? That's chapter 3. I'm going to put that aside. Now I want to go to chapter 4. Let me go to the Upon Liberty, to the actual text itself. So if chapter 1 made the argument that we should, as competent rational adults, be free to engage in behaviors that only harm ourselves, that's well enough and good, right? Maybe that gives you a broad spectrum of choices, a lot of freedom in your life to do what you want. You can smoke or you can drink, you can skydive, you can do none of those things. And maybe with that area of freedom, you can be quite creative. You can decide to take up painting, you can decide to be an accountant, you can decide to be a chemist. And as long as you're not harming non-consenting, adult, rational third parties, have at it, right? I'm going to use the smoking example just as another example here. I used to be a smoker, not anymore. But every once in a while, I'll be on campus and I'll pass someone smoking. And unlike some other ex-smokers, sometimes that secondhand smoke, it's kind of nice. It reminds me of the old days. If I've consented to be part of your harm, go on a drinking binge with you. We're not driving and drinking. We're just drinking together. Or I walk past you and you're smoking. If I'm consenting to that, even if that's harmful to me, that's on me, right? I knew it could be harmful. You didn't ask me, but I'm agreeably or willfully being part of your plan. Your night out drinking, walking by you smoking. In that sense, you're not doing something wrong to me. Now, I didn't want it, right? And you were smoking outside my office at Holy Cross. Pretend we're back on campus. If I don't want it, then there is a harm to me because I'm not seeking it and I'm not looking for the second party harm. So try to keep some of those examples in mind. Chapter 4 is a title of the limits to the authority of society over the individual. Sort of tells you where he's headed. It takes chapter 1 and gives you some more fine-tuned rules about just how is it that this harm principle is supposed to be applied. And there should be some limits to the authority of society. I assume anybody from the age of 18, the age of majority in most states, till death, thinks that there's some legitimate way society gets to set rules for us. Society being either legally or civil society, your clubs, your friends, your family. There's some limits to that authority. Just what are they, right? What Mill is going to tell us in the first few sections of chapter 4 is when the harm is really, really severe, that you exercising your freedom due to second parties, then the response to what you're doing by exercising your freedom can also be severe or strict or significant. But the less and less you end up harming second parties, the less severely, the less strictly, the less importantly, if you want, then society, others, third parties, second parties, get to respond less and less to what you're doing. So let me sort of walk you through this. You can go look at the text, and I'll look or the notes, whatever, and I'll walk through this section D, which outlines what he does in chapter 4. So, first thing, if in fact you are injuring others' interests, right, violating their rights, that requires a legal response, right? So the most significant harm you can do to second parties when you're exercising your liberty is by law, or maybe by tacit understanding if there's no law. If someone has a right to free speech, to vote, to own a firearm, at least federally in the United States, certainly in Texas as well, if you violate their rights exercising your freedom, that's a pretty significant harm to second parties. And then there should be a legal response. So again, I'm an artist, I'm on YouTube, and I say, hey, I've got this new song out, I'm going to release an album, you can go download it, but you have to pay a few dollars. And you steal it and you send it all over the internet. That's pretty significant harm to me. I make my livelihood by music, and you've stolen it, and you said, well, I should be free to do that. I don't know who it was, David Bowie, that said music wants to be free. Well, I'm sure artists think that's great until somebody pays me. I'm not really on board with that. So if you steal, you assault somebody, whatever the sort of top 10, crimes are, felonies, certainly we think I have an interest in not having those things happen to me. I have a right to those things not happening to me. And if you exercise your liberty and violate those rights, the law responds. That's pretty serious. Fair share of community defense. So this is another way that exercising your liberty may be less severe than violating your rights harms somebody else. So maybe you want to say, I don't want to pay taxes. I'm David Thoreau. I don't want to support American military buildup or whatever. Or even just your local community. Don't want to pay property taxes at all, period. I won't do it. I know they go towards, keeping me safe and secure. And I realize right now we're having a big discussion about police. Let's just assume that there is a legitimate role for police in protecting life and property, even if it's not ideally what we're seeing right now in the current discussion. But I don't want to pay my taxes for police at all, period. Or, anything that keeps us safe. Traffic lights, right? When they're working operationally, people can come and go. They get to work, they go to school, they go to the park. This is, pre-pandemic days, but let's say we're getting back there. I don't want even traffic lights that are part of having a healthy, safe society. Well, you don't pay those taxes, and others don't pay those taxes. We don't have common defense, whether it's national military, state guard, local police, traffic lights. So in Mill's world, yes, if you violate somebody's rights, the law gets to respond because you've harmed them in a way they didn't consent to. Then if you don't provide for common defense, you're not doing your fair share. We can restrict your liberty, mandate that you pay certain kind of taxes, whether it's property or income, to provide for the common defense. Taking a step down on the kind of harm you could do to second parties against their will, exercising your freedom. And I'm going like this because sometimes people say, you don't get to tell me what to do. I'm an adult. I get to make my own free choices. And Mill's answer here in chapters 1 and 4 is, yeah, sure, but there's got to be some way of limiting when it's improper, the kind of freedom you're exercising in advancing your own interest. And the way to limit it, in his view, I'm going to repeat this ad nauseum, but bear with me, is if your freedom in its exercise as competent, rational, knowledgeable, free-thinking adult harms certain kinds of interests and rights and values of others against their will, then yes, actually I can say by law or by social pressure, we can make you stop. But when you're only hurting yourself, that's another matter. So I'm on D4 here. So not violating somebody's rights, because law gets to respond to that. Not doing your fair part for community defense. Law gets to say something about that. D4, what about acts which are hurtful to others, but don't violate their rights? Mill's answer here is, you can still hurt somebody, just not as badly this way. You punish here by opinion and not by law. I asked you on the outline, can you think of a modern example? Anything anyone says to you that's mean on the internet at all, period. And I assume this has happened to everybody. Not a First Amendment violation necessarily for someone to say something mean about you. Technically speaking, the First Amendment applies only to the government, restricting your speech. If a private citizen is mean to you on the social internet, there's no First Amendment issue there, unless it's libelous or slanderous or threatening or something like that. What if somebody says something mean to you on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter? Mill's answer is, okay, it hurts. Not a serious legal violation per se. Say it's not slander or libel, whatever. You respond by opinion. And if you look up the ACLU or any First Amendment organization, this is exactly what they say. You don't like bad speech, mean speech, there's counter speech. You respond by opinion. You're wrong, right? Or you about to say about the speaker, you're mean-spirited, right? So as the harm to the other parties, when you exercise your liberty, gets less and less, the response, less and less severe or dramatic or whatever, the response Mill warrants here is less and less. There's still a response. You don't have to just sit there and go be mean to me on the internet. But here, the response isn't a legal one. You punish somebody by speaking ill of them, hopefully in a civil fashion. D5, and this gets closer to the harm principle, What if you only harm yourselves? I mean, truly, like the example I gave earlier of your smoking roommate who goes outside to smoke. She doesn't smoke near the vent. She doesn't come back in, smoke in the apartment. She doesn't leave her clothes, which smell of tobacco, like in your laundry hamper. I mean, it's clearly just hurting herself. Mill's answer here, and this is, maybe we should look at the language because I've sort of paraphrased in here without the quotes. Let's see. Let's get back to Mill. And let me find the section I want to do. Did I give you the number there? I can look it up. I didn't write down the section number here. Let's see. Am I in chapter? Oh, that's 1. I should be in 4. Okay. Chapter 4. Here we go. There's no room for entertaining any such question interfering with somebody who's just harming themselves. When a person's conduct affects the interests of no person beside himself, so my smoking example, she's only affecting her own self, or needs not affect them unless they like it, can affect somebody else that likes it, he walking by and enjoying the secondhand smoke. And again here, everyone has to be of full age and the ordinary understanding. So kids are out, right? And we'll say more about that in a minute. Or if they don't have sufficient understanding, they're out. Say more about that in a minute. In all such cases, you're only hurting yourself, not harming anyone else against their will. They understand what they're getting into. I do when I walk by a smoker and I look for the secondhand smoke. There should be, and this is a huge claim, so I'm going to pause here, perfect freedom, so total liberty, legal and social, do the action, do the smoking outside, stand the consequences, face the music. It's on you now if you get lung cancer or pneumonia or whatever. There it is. So his basic principle, from the most serious harm you can do to somebody else is violate their legal rights and interests, so law responds, to the least serious harm you can do to somebody else is you're only hurting yourself, not hurting anyone else unless they want to stand next to you and be harmed. You're smoking and drinking. You should have, you just harming you, and you're an adult and rational and all those things we're talking about. Have perfect freedom, legal and social, do the action, and you stand or face the consequences. So you get sick because of the smoking, that's on you. You don't get sick, lucky you. Statistically not likely, but still, right? That's totally up to you. Okay, so let me get back. What are the proper social responses to this? And this is going to be the very next couple of sections. So Mill does not say about your friend, the smoker, the drinker, the drug user, the skydiver, pick your poison, whatever your friends and loved ones do that hurts them and you don't like. Mill doesn't say you're out of luck. You can't do anything about it. What he does say is you can't force them to stop. In fact, you shouldn't force them to stop by law or social pressure. But there are other tools you have that respect their liberty and maybe make them more inclined to come over to your way. And frankly, if there's anything a college should do, it should say to you at some level, we shouldn't be compelling, I'm using Mill in a collegiate context, we shouldn't be compelling people, forcing them, coercing them, pressuring them to do X, Y, or Z. If we really think people are adults on campus and we want them to do something, we should convince them. Now, I know you're probably thinking, this is not the way the meal plan works. This is not the way Residence Life works. Right? Those are all things you signed in advance, right? You knew what the rules were, or you could have looked them up when you were given the thing, the contract for meal plans or whatever. But as far as your adult behavior, and I think this is probably true at St. Ed's and around the country and colleges, you're an adult, you want to stay up all night drinking, right? Smoking, I realize these things are against the law and against policies for residence halls, but bear with me. You stand the consequences, right? You're tired for the next day's class or test or lab. Or if you're an athlete or an actor, you stay up all night smoking, you're going to pay the price on the athletic field or on stage. So the idea here is we should trust adults well enough, more or less, and we're going to see the more or less in a minute, to make decisions for themselves, right, without compelling or coercing them to do otherwise. But we could still interact with them to get them to come over to our way of thinking. So what Mill says here in section 4, and you can look at that in the text, is education should promote the self-regarding behaviors, right? Self-regarding, I should have said that in the outline. I'll update this later. Self-regarding acts, or, yeah, acts is fine. by persuasion and not force. So I should try to educate people, whether I'm in St. Ed's or not, about why smoking is bad, right? What it does to your lungs and your health and so on, especially if you're an actor or an athlete. You're not going to perform at peak performance with smoking the way you might do. And you probably don't want to force someone to do it. Why? And he says this also in section 4. If people are most interested in their own well-being, like it's not hard to convince people to be concerned for themselves. Maybe the harder thing is to get people to be concerned for others. Since you're mostly concerned for yourself, I should appeal to those kinds of things when I try to win you over. Like actor or athlete, you're not going to perform peak performance if you're smoking and drinking all the time. You're just not. And for that matter, scientist in the lab, philosopher writing a paper. So since you're most interested in your own well-being, I should try to convince you, those things to excess especially, not so good. Why else would you want to interact with people without compelling them to come around to your way of thinking? He says also in 4, society interferes poorly. The argument here would be second parties, and I get this is not the policy, but bear with me. Your RA, your older sibling, your neighbor, a civic group, they're not going to know you as well as you know yourself. So when they sort of step in and try to compel you by forcing you, with sanctioning you or something, to do something, they're going to interfere in the wrong place at the wrong time because they don't know you as well as you know you, right? Now, this doesn't mean, and this is in 7, that we can't make the actor who is hurting himself, it doesn't mean we can't make him uncomfortable. I don't have to hang out with you if you're a smoker or drinker, right? Or a skydiver or whatever. On the other hand, I might bum a cigarette, get free drinks. But if you're really that uncomfortable with how somebody behaves in the way they're behaving toward themselves, you can say, I won't hang out with you. You can shun them. You can ignore them. I assume these are kinds of pressures people feel in any case. I mean, I know, and certainly in my case, if my partner or my siblings or my best friend said to me, your late night Netflix activity starting to have its toll. Maybe you have one too many scotches late at night, and that's starting to affect our friendship with you because we don't see you as much. Then I might go, oh yeah, that's true. And if I don't want to lose them, I should probably keep better hours or drink less or something like that. So that's sort of the basic argument. I've run really through it quickly. I want to answer one line drawing problem here in 7 on your outline. Mill addresses here in On Liberty, as he does in Utilitarianism, as lots of philosophers do if they're doing their jobs. How might someone object to my views? I'm speaking as Mill. And one problem you might imagine this theory having on liberty, the harm principle, shows up in section 8. And I'll read from the outline here. Aren't all self-regarding harms also other regarding harms? That is, isn't anything you do to yourself that's harmful in some fashion also harming somebody else? So I'm going to step out of Mill for a minute and go to the Bill Clinton article. If you read the Bill Clinton article, there's an argument there saying that Patrick, who is a competent, rational adult, Friday night grows his own pot, wants to have a couple friends over, sit on the back deck, so he's not buying it from an illegal dealer who's supporting illegal and violent behavior in the transit of drugs to the United States. He could be in states that make it legal now, for all that matter. I'm thinking Colorado. I'm blanking on if there's another one. So buys a little, grows a little, whatever. Let's suppose it's legal. Has his friends over, competent, rational adult. Wife's inside the house with the little kid. Friends are reminiscing about their week, talking about, whatever they're going to do that weekend. You might think, oh, he's only hurting himself, right? On the other hand, if the pot smoking he's doing hurts his lungs, and arguably it does, I mean, maybe eating it as a brownie would be different, but let's assume he's smoking it, maybe he won't be there for his friends when they need him. In fact, maybe if one of them wants to talk about some terrible thing at work or heartbreak he's having, and Patrick's too stoned to notice, he's not there as a listening ear, as a sympathetic friend. We'll get to in a minute how you might even argue, well, if he's stoned every Friday night, maybe his wife and kids, and this was in the Bill Clinton article, will argue, hey, you're not there for us. We expected you to be around for years and years. You're harming your body. And frankly, we're going to have less time with you. So you get the idea. Sometimes when I teach this in class, I say, any coffee you would buy at Starbucks ahead of me in line might make them say when I get up there, sorry, no French roast. That person bought the last one. So you might say, well, coffee only affects me. It's not a big deal. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. You're buying the last cup of French roast. Now I'm hurt because I'm not getting it. Now, this is not a big harm, but I wanted my French roast. And if anything you do might diminish the supply of material goods or anything for somebody else, then by definition, what you've done that's harmed yourself, coffee drinking is not necessarily good for you, is harmful to second parties. So, wow. So how do we figure out how to let people do things that only hurt them if everything that hurts them could arguably hurt somebody else? If everything I do, I've got some lemonade here, is a little less lemonade you get when you go to HEB, maybe during a pandemic especially, right? Because I go in for my Crystal Light lemonade and I buy the last one. Now you don't get one. So I can't even have it, and it's probably not necessarily good for me. I don't know, maybe it is. So how do you draw a line between the things that only hurt me, which I'm allowed to do, and I'm a competent, rational adult, and I'm not harming non-consenting second parties. How do I draw a line between that stuff that hurts me and the stuff that definitely hurts you, right? Violating your rights, stealing from you, and so on. Well, Mill has an answer, and it's in sections 10, 11, mostly 10, 11. And I'm reading from the outline here, and it goes something like this. If I violate when I hurt myself a distinct and assignable obligation I have to someone else, that moves my self-harm to the other regarding behavior that we can regulate. So I'll go back to the Bill Clinton article. Do I, in fact, if I'm Patrick and my spouse and kid are inside and I'm out in the back deck with my friend smoking pot, legal pot, and I won't get like super stoned, but I'll get a good buzz on. Have I violated, this is the answer on the screen, a distinct and assignable obligation to someone else? Well, you might argue yes. Specifically, I have a clear duty, obligation to my spouse not to mess up my body too badly. And maybe we argue every week smoking pot starts to do that. Is that obligation a clear one? I mean, I don't have it for my neighbor or some kids across the street or some couple 3 blocks down. I have a clear, distinct duty to my spouse, or in my case, my partner, Jenny Veninga, not to so damage my body, this is a duty I owe her, that even if it doesn't harm you all when I'm smoking pot, I'll make myself Patrick, Friday night on the back deck, it's legal pot, and I'm not grading when I do it, so you can't say that I violated that promise. It might be Patrick's partner, my partner, in Patrick's shoes, would say, that's a clear duty. You're supposed to do stuff that helps me, and this doesn't help me. And that's assignable to you. When we got together, we decided, Jenny and I, or Patrick and his partner, like what we were going to do as a couple. We assigned certain duties to one another, like you would go to work these days, and I would go to work these days, and you wouldn't hurt yourself with drinking too much, and I won't hurt myself with skydiving too much, or, whatever. If all of a sudden, things that I do that I should be free to do because they only hurt me have now hurt special, certain close proximity partners of ours, in my case, Jenny, Patrick, his case, his spouse, then there's a clear, distinct, it's, you can draw boundaries around it, assignable, like who has the duty, of that person not to do that self-harming thing. So, you might argue, that Patrick has this to his partner, I have it to my partner as well, even though I don't owe it to everybody else. Sorry, I'm working up a steam, so I'm going to try to figure out how to fit that in. As far as other examples, and Mill talks about these in the chapter, if a self-harm doesn't violate a specific duty to the public or causes no definite risk of damage or perceptible hurt, then we don't stop it by force, right? A couple of things to say about this. So a police officer who drinks on duty, he can't say, oh, well, I should be at liberty to drink on duty, because obviously him drinking on duty violates a duty to the public. Clear duty he has, distinctly for him, assignable to him, right? Maybe other people can drink on duty, but cops with guns, no. airline pilots, no. So they don't have the liberty to do that because it would cause definite damage or a definite risk of damage. But if you're engaging in a certain self-harming activity, smoking, drinking, skydiving, whatever, and it's not causing, I'm in B here again, a perceptible hurt in a way that sort of matters, you should be at liberty to do it. Now, I'm going to read here as well. Mill may mean that if you hurt my feelings about what you say, that's not enough to hurt or harm or restrict your liberty. But if you harm me in a perceptible, palpable way, right, you'd say, please don't do this, online that I'm a max murderer, and let's assume I'm not. And then all of a sudden my dean says, we don't want an axe murderer on the philosophy faculty, we're going to have to fire you. That really is a perceptible, palpable kind of harm that we can measure. So again, Mill's answer here for how can you decide when something's so harmful to the self that even if it generally doesn't harm everybody else, it's going to harm some other people and we can make them stop. This is his answer. So I'm going to pop over to the Bill Clinton article. Hopefully I still have it. And I should say Bill Clinton didn't write this, which you probably figured out by now if you Googled it. A couple years ago, I wrote this with a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist and a friend of mine who does medical research. And I'm going to read some of the passage here for Patrick. Patrick's wife and son might make a different claim than other second parties, that smoking pot is not merely a self-regarding harm. Penelope could might argue she agreed with Patrick that he wouldn't damage his lungs because even though it helps him relax, she worries that he's recapturing his college days. Let's just assume he smoked pot in college, right? Or that he would harm himself and get ill and die, and that would deprive Paul of a father. This argument moves Patrick's self-regarding harm to the other regarding realm. And of course, Penelope may have a point here. Anything Patrick do could harm himself and therefore harm his wife and kids, right? But there might be a difference between I have an occasional sandwich that's harmful to me, so my spouse gets to say, hey, back off, to every Friday night, smoking pot on the back deck. So this is the way he did it. When I'm on the fortunately paragraph, Patrick's wife and son are nearly connected to him. Patrick, that's Bill. They have a connection to him that other people don't have, right? Through their sympathies and interests. I mean, they love and care for him and vice versa. So when he harms himself, it hurts them in a different kind of special way than when, say, his friends see him harm himself, or hell, his coworkers hear next Monday that he's been smoking pot Monday night. Mill's examples, of course, are a person who can't pay his debts and and therefore can't support his family, or a police officer who's drunk on duty. We recognize there that there's a clear, distinct, assignable to the party harming himself duty not to do those things for special others, right? For the cop, it's the public, and for the fellow in debt, it's his family. In other words, Mills appears to be arguing that adults have a clear, distinct promise or vow to protect certain others, and then they've given themselves special duties not to harm themselves too much. Now, of course, Patrick has a response here. He could argue that not all his self-regarding behaviors are the same and having a negative effect on his family. He might say that, well, it doesn't violate his role responsibilities to being a husband and father. I mean, plenty of people engage in occasional drinking, pot smoking in Colorado anyway, and cigarette smoking that they want to argue don't necessarily impair their ability to work or be a loving family member. The harm might not be significant compared to other things he does, like, eating chocolate ice cream. I'm just sort of making an argument by analogy. So Mill could give Patrick here an answer. He could even say, Patrick, although maybe this is stretching it, that him being allowed to smoke pot without the paternalistic limits on his choices, whether by the state, public, or even his spouse and kid, if he doesn't have a special, distinct, clear duty to them not to smoke at all. It could be smoking pot. I've heard people say this enhances their ability to enjoy music or poetry. So arguably here, and if you wrote on the higher or lower pleasure from Mill from that chapter, you might say, well, certain higher pleasures, music, art, culture, maybe religion, that's involved in some certain kind of chemicals, alcohol and pot are involved in certain religious ceremonies. It might enhance those experiences as intrinsic pleasures, in addition to being a physical one. So it could be that there's some sort of interdependence or connection or cross enhancement. I'm making up the words here. So you get back to the Mill outline. There are some limits on what people can do to hurt themselves because it might hurt somebody else. Not everybody who's somebody else, right? But somebody. So again, Jenny might argue my pot smoking on Friday night with Patrick long term is going to hurt my health, and I made a special, clear and distinct, assignable promise to me, to her, from me, not to do that. My neighbors don't get to have that claim on me. Even my parents. I'm over 18 and 55. But people close to you by sympathies and interests, your immediate family, maybe your friends if you're that close to them. It wouldn't apply to everything. It might apply to some pot smoking that's excessive or some drinking that's excessive. Certainly I have public duties as a teacher not to grade when I'm drinking, and I don't. So the limits of what counts as a self-regarding harm that you're allowed to do, that no one can restrict you from doing, is not just it violates somebody else's interests or rights in a palpable, measurable, material, concrete way, stealing, libeling them. It's not just that. It's this special case, which at least in some cases takes the self-regarding behavior out of just the self-regarding class and makes it a hurting second-party behavior. By way of conclusion, I think I'm coming up on 50 minutes. Mill does say in section 12, if you do interfere with someone's self-regarding harm, and you're not a family member connected by sympathies and interests, you're not a special friend, you're not someone at work who has a claim on them not to do it because there's something contractual or some promise they made not to drink on the job, you'll do it wrongly in the wrong place. So that's section 12. You might wonder if this is true. When second parties interfere with your self-regarding choices, free choices, to hurt yourself, smoking, drinking, skydiving, certain kinds of eating, non-exercise, do they do it wrongly and in the wrong place? And I can think of cases where that's the case. I certainly resented, and still do, but resented when well-intentioned but meaningful second parties who weren't my family, friends would say, "Oh, you shouldn't have that second scotch. That's really gonna, hurt your brain." Or when I was a smoker, you shouldn't take so many smoke breaks during the day. Typically, what I would say to them is, "Thank you for your concern. Thank you for not stealing my cigarettes, trying to guilt me out of it. You could argue with me about it. You could try to convince me not to do it. But if you interfere in any other way," my teenage son, when he found out I was smoking, used to say, I did smoke before he was born, I would have just stolen your cigarettes. That's not going to work. I'm just going to buy some more cigarettes, right? You've interfered in the wrong place and at the wrong time. So the examples that Mill uses, and you can read the remaining sections, he talks about art world, alcohol regulations. Lots of states have blue laws. These might be more... No, actually, they exist in Texas too, right? Times and places where you can't buy alcohol. I know in Austin, HEB won't sell wine until 12 noon. Yes, I've checked. Liquor stores are closed on Sunday. That seems to be perhaps the vestige of a more religious country that felt maybe people shouldn't drink on Sunday. Seems to me there's an on-liberty application to apply there. Mill was a defender of religious liberty. In section 21, he talks about the way Mormons were persecuted in his day. Certainly, if any religious group says we worship peaceably, we don't coerce people to show up at our ceremonies, we don't hurt them when they show up at our ceremonies, people engaged in communal prayer and worship of their God should be at liberty to do that, again, unless, and arguably I can't think of religions that do this, right, that survive very long or get our respect, unless they are harming non-consenting second parties in the religious practice. I'll leave you with one case study just to think about because it's happening right now in the public. We're still grappling with this. So as I record this, June 17 of 2020, Texas is starting to open back up. In some limited fashion, restaurants are open, churches are open. One application of On Liberty that you might apply to that case study is this. Should people be at liberty to go to the church of their choice, the restaurant of their choice, in small groups and in larger groups, in closer proximity than 6 feet? What would Mill say about you should be free to engage in self-harming behavior. And granted, if Jenny and I, we don't, went to a restaurant or bar in Austin with lots of people, you might say you should be at liberty to harm yourself. Go ahead, get within 6 feet of a server and don't wear a mask. Go to the beach, go to Town Lake here in Austin. If that ends up getting you infected and your partner infected, well, you can stand the consequences. You knew it could be harmful. Now, this is tricky because, and we will be opening up St. Edward's with certain precautions in the fall, so think about the case study here. If I decide my liberty should be allowing me to harm myself and my partner makes the same judgment, and we go out to a restaurant and we're within 6 feet of a lot of people, or we go to a beach, same thing, Town Lake, and we get sick and it does harm us, have I violated a distinct and assignable duty to second parties that I have a special duty not to? I've got 2 kids, a 2-year-old and a 16-year-old. For that matter, if it were to happen, and then after a week down walking around Town Lake or going to Deep Eddy or whatever, I went to campus and I didn't take precautions because I don't want people putting masks on and wearing plexiglass dividers when they're in a classroom and whatever we're going to be doing in the fall. You might say, well, wait a minute. You, instructor, it's not legal, it should be, have a distinct and assignable duty to me, students, not to take terrible risks. And in the name of a pandemic, my drinking at home is one thing, but my engaging in those behaviors, which could harm you, is something else. So the pandemic gives us a case study for this. I don't presume to have the answer. I'm not going to be able to figure that out in 2 minutes. But that's sort of where we're at now. I think I've been through the whole outline. Let me say a little bit about next week. Next week is the last week, and we're going to talk about the very, very, very famous, probably the most famous, second or third most famous political trial of all time, the trial execution of Socrates. Read the overview again before you get into the text. I've done a very long summary here of sections you should focus on, especially when it comes to the final. We will next week try to apply the theories to date, at least in brief, because this is the final. I'm not going to do it all for you in the lecture, but you should try to think through, as you're reading the Socrates and looking at my overview, what would Mill of utilitarianism say? What would a Kantian say? What would a virtue theorist say? What would someone in On Liberty say about the fact that Socrates was tried for corrupting the youth, found guilty, and sentenced to death? So it's giving you a chance to apply those theories themselves to the case study, which, like I said, again, was the final. So I think that's everything. Let me see if I get the clap. Here we go. Questions, comments, let me know. I'm posting this shortly, so it can be up at 6:30. Office hours, again, move to 8:30. And again, if you want to talk about one of your papers or whatever, I need a day or two in advance notice, but I can move half-hour slots around and do a time that works for everybody. So we'll see you next week.